Well, happy Friday and welcome to today's taping of the 4 and 3 podcast. Dan Andros here, Trey Goins-Phillips over there. And it's like movie-like stories today, Trey. I mean, the Haiti stuff and churches burning in Canada. It's some wild stuff going on this week. Wild stuff.
Yeah.
So, and a judge ordering Sharia. I mean, what do we... In Texas, of all places. Crazy
case,
stuff.
I don't think I'm ever going to be able to wrap my mind around that judge's ruling. Obviously, I'm not a legal scholar and can't really interpret the law with her level of skill and all that kind of stuff. But it's hard for me to see how, like you said, of all places, Texas, how somebody can be forced to go to a Sharia law tribunal for their divorce proceeding.
Me either, but we're going to dive into the details. So in case you're new here, we are taping. This is the 4 and 3 podcast, which, by the way, you can subscribe over on faithwire.com/podcasts on iTunes. And go ahead if you've been with us every day here and you listen to the podcast throughout the week. It's news from a Christian perspective. We cover the biggest stories of the day and try to bring you a Christian perspective on those stories. And so leave a rating over on iTunes. Apparently, that's how the kids notice. When you leave a rating, so go ahead and do that. But we're going to fire up the taping, and then it gets posted later on the iTunes. So this is just the taping. So we're going to roll that and fire that up and get going. Oops, not with that button. Okay, right now, so stand by.
Faithwire.com.
Well, hello and welcome to 4 and 3, a podcast breaking down 4 of the most important stories of the day and 3 things you need to know about them, all from a Christian perspective. Today is Friday, July 9th, 2021. I'm Dan Andros, and coming up on the podcast today, details on Haiti's assassination emerges, and it's like something out of a movie. And a Canadian journalist has warned of dark days ahead for religious liberty amid church fires. And a sex ed teacher has resigned after a shock lesson to 6-year-olds. Just disturbing stuff here. And a Texas judge has denied a woman's divorce proceedings and ordered her to appear in a Sharia law tribunal. We'll have these stories and more with Trey Goins-Phillips from Faithwire.com. Trey, how are you on this Friday, sir?
I'm good. Happy Friday to you.
You as well.
So these stories, like you said in the lead up before we started recording here, are just crazy. Weird stories. It's hard to think. I mean, the stuff that's been going on in Canada since the pandemic began has just been increasingly mind-boggling with the way they've shut down churches and stuff. And now 10 plus churches have been set on fire. I know we talked about this the other day, and I'll talk about it a little bit more on the podcast today. And it's just kind of like, they're right there, they're our neighboring country, and we kind of equate the two. Their culture is similar to our culture in a lot of ways, but some of this stuff is just crazy to me that it's happening so close to home.
Yeah, Canada has gone off the rails and are not going in the right direction. And our first story that we're going to dive into here, Trey, is Haiti, and they are clearly in a lot of trouble right now. And man, it's a country that, as I talked about earlier, Trey, in this week, it's a country near and dear to my heart. I only had one visit there, but it really, left an indelible mark on sort of my heart and soul, just meeting some people there and seeing how they live. And when you see the violence that's happened there over the past few weeks, that was troubling enough. But then you had the assassination of their president. It really put things over the top. And the details that are coming out now are like something, as I said, out of a movie. And an armed group of alleged professional killers stormed the president's home and shot him 16 times, at least 16 times. And now there are 17 suspects that have been arrested in the shooting, with at least 8 more being sought after. And 2 of them have U.S. citizenship, or Haitian Americans. So we'll have the details on that here in just a second. But the details that are coming in, the reports that are coming in are it's fast and furious. It's hard to know what to trust because you have a whole lot of corruption, a whole lot of chaos going on there right now. And some of that chaos where 3 suspects were killed in a shootout with police. This was after a group of 11 armed suspects just showed up at Taiwan's embassy, which Taiwan described as mercenaries. Those were arrested without resistance. And then you add to the plot that while 15 of the detainees were from Colombia, and 2 of those, as I mentioned, were Haitian Americans. One of them, James Solages, his arrest has left family members confused and in shock. He's a 35-year-old Haitian American from South Florida, and he's a U.S. citizen from Haiti originally. His family said he's a man of integrity who did charity work in Haiti. He was the president of a Florida nonprofit organization named after Jacmel, which is a town on the southern coast of Haiti. He'd hoped to be mayor there someday, so he was an aspiring politician. His relatives said, "We can't believe it. I don't think he's capable of doing these things. I think somebody used him." Joseph Vincent is the other American in custody, and I don't have as many details on him yet, but not everyone is buying the government's version of the story. According to NPR, officials had given out a little information on the killing other than to say that the attack was carried out by a highly trained and heavily armed group. Family members also say, by the way, when you take that into account, highly trained, heavily armed, family members of that American Haitian who was arrested said he wasn't in the military and didn't have any training. So they were saying it was out of character for him. So that's odd. But not everyone was buying that government description. When a Haitian journalist who writes for a local newspaper, tweeted a report on comments by the police chief, it was a flood of responses on social media expressing skepticism. And a lot of people were wondering how if these attackers were so sophisticated and went in there and penetrated President Moise's home, a security detail, a panic room, and then they escaped unharmed. They went through all that. He's got a security detail. There's a panic room. They go in. No shots are fired except for towards the president. And then they're all just caught without a successful getaway. It seems unlikely. You have this successful entrance and attack, and then you're just all caught, with the next day with very little resistance. Obviously, except for the couple ones that did have a shootout, but then you have dozens others arrested without any incident. But the details of the attack were crazy. He was shot a dozen times in his office. His bedroom was ransacked. Wow. His daughter hid in her brother's room during the attack, and a maid and another worker were tied up. His eye was shot out. There were some reports saying that he was tortured. Haiti's ambassador to Washington said that the killers were professional, disguised as U.S. drug enforcement. So they were kind of yelling DEA when they came in. And so just very, very sketchy details and a lot of distrust as the government narrative of events. Not everything adds up in the story, so we'll see as details come out. But obviously not a right or left issue here, Trey. But, as we discussed the other day, just to be praying for Haiti. I mean, there's so many American groups there and charities that are on the ground. And so, not just for Americans, but on a human level, it's not only a beautiful place, but, as I just from being there for a week or so, you meet some of the people there, and there's just so many awesome people there. A lot of Christians, trying to live in the midst of that. And it's just sad to see it all devolving. And, and I think, when we look at it and we say, oh, look at that chaos and look at these barbarians that are out there, arming themselves and creating militias and gangs to protect themselves, et cetera, et cetera. But I think we underestimate the level of fear and sin that can happen when the security blanket of prosperity, those blinders of prosperity that makes us think we're so civilized, when you lose all that, I think people can go a whole different direction.
Yeah, and I think it kind of shows that a lot of that stuff, a lot of those structures that we have in place here in the West and the United States they're pretty fragile, any of these things that we have set up can fall apart in an instant. It's just based on a mutual understanding and a mutual desire to maintain that order. But whenever something happens, whatever the tipping point is, whether it's corruption or it's frustration, political anger, and it could be any number of things. Whatever that tipping point is, all it takes is one last straw, and everything can come toppling down. So I don't think we should necessarily look down on the country and say like, oh, we would never be like that.
Yeah.
But certainly be in prayer for them, because that it's awful to see that wherever it's happening, whether it's in Haiti or anywhere else. That kind of destruction is difficult, because not only do you see the heartbreak and the horror of what's happening in the moment, but you also have to think, when it stops, what's going to be there? What's going to be left?
Yeah.
Where are they going to have to start the rebuilding process from? And particularly with Haiti, I mean, they've been through so much. Their country has just been kind of hit over and over and over again, with natural disasters, as well as political corruption and all of that. So it just seems like they're due for a break, I hope. It's just they've dealt with a whole lot.
Yep, definitely keep Haiti in your prayers for sure.
So, all right, story number 2. So, as the fires continue to burn in Canada, Ezra Levant, he's a right-leaning journalist in the country, he's likening the rash of church arsons to the early signs of the systemic persecution of Jewish people in the lead-up to Nazi Germany. Levant told Tucker Carlson this week that he's reluctant to use the word Kristallnacht, referring to the night in pre-war Germany when Jewish synagogues were destroyed, but warned Canada is enduring what he described as dark days for religious freedom. So we talked about this on the podcast earlier this week, but here's a little recap. So Levant's comments come as several churches, mostly belonging to Catholic or Anglican denominations, have been burned to the ground amid the discovery of unmarked graves at erstwhile schools for Indigenous children. So roughly 150,000 Indigenous Canadians were forced to attend the Indian residential school system, which is largely operated by the Catholic Church, over a period of about 120 years. And then in 2015, a government commission concluded that the system was guilty of so-called cultural genocide against those Indigenous groups. Since May, though, more than 1,100 unmarked graves of children have been discovered on the former grounds of those shuttered schools in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and British Columbia. And Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, he offered a soft condemnation of the attacks in late June. He said it's not the way to go, referring to the arsons. And after facing a lot of criticism, including from Levant, Trudeau finally condemned the arsons in a little bit stronger wording late last week, calling them unacceptable and wrong. He did, though, add that he understands their anger. So what's the left saying? Well, several on the left in Canada have been more accepting, of excusing the arsons. Obviously, nobody is out there promoting it for the most part. There are, though, some who actually are. So the leader of the British Columbia Civil Liberties Association, Harsha Walia, Dan, I think you mentioned her earlier this week. She tweeted, "Burn it all down," referring to the Catholic churches in Canadian provinces. And although he said the arsons were wrong, Gerald Butts, he's the former Canadian principal secretary to Trudeau, like I said, he did condemn the arson, but he said that the fires are understandable. So it's been kind of a soft condemnation at best from the left, and then even a few who have outright endorsed it. So what's the right saying? Well, here in the U.S., people like Tucker Carlson have been condemning the attacks as wrong. Canadian journalist Danielle Hamamjian, I'm sure I'm butchering her last name, she pointed out that there's a big difference in Trudeau's messaging in 2015 when one mosque was set on fire, and his messaging now when 10 plus churches have been set ablaze. His condemnation for the latter has taken weeks, and it hasn't been all that strong. But in 2015, here's what he said when one mosque was set on fire. To families who attend the mosque for prayer every week, the Government of Canada and our law enforcement agencies will protect your rights and make every effort to apprehend the perpetrator. So quite a difference in response there. He said burning churches is not the way to go, and I don't think that the government has made many, if any, arrests so far in these arsons. But he had quite a strong message in 2015 when there was one mosque set on fire. So that she just pointed out the difference there in his messaging. So why does it matter? Well, as believers, we need to, of course, be praying for a stop to this kind of violence, for justice, and for the courage of the government, including Justin Trudeau, to step up and defend the rights and religious liberties of Canadian citizens. We also just need to be in prayer for Canada generally. Like I said at the beginning of the podcast, the country has just been through so much in regards to restricting religious liberty. Since the pandemic began, they've been arresting and imprisoning pastors for holding church services amid COVID restrictions. And now we're seeing 10 plus churches set on fire for nonsensical reasons. And it seems like the government has been pretty weak in its response. So as believers, I think we should need to be praying for our brothers and sisters at church in Canada.
Yeah, and for people to have the courage to just stand up when something is wrong, right? And just don't worry about being PC. And it just seems like when you watch politicians today, they're calculating, well, who's the loudest group and who's going to complain the most? How hard is it to say, don't burn a church down? What are you doing? What are you doing?
Yeah.
Like, how does burning a church help anyone? Well, it's not the way to go. I mean, that's a weak response to somebody burning down churches. And if anyone noticed there, if you're watching on the live stream and you could see the video here, that's from the Canadian Broadcast Company there. It's a church made up of descendants of these First Nation, these Native Canadians. And so you're harming the very people that you're allegedly mad about. So that doesn't add up at all. If these people are mad about these offenses against Indigenous people from these schools and finding these unmarked graves and finding kids there, and we don't know exactly what the deal is there yet. If you're mad about that, why are you burning down their descendants' churches? What how does that help? So a lot of just things not adding up here. But regardless, go ahead.
On I was just going to say, on our story on Faithwire, we've got a video. There are Indigenous leaders and members of First Nations groups who are coming out and condemning, asking them, please stop. Because like you said, it's hurting these Indigenous populations who are members of these churches. And also they're targeting other churches. There's one Protestant church, for example, that you talked about, Dan, the other day, that's made up of Vietnamese refugees. And their church was burned to the ground. So it's just... their anger with the way they're lashing out, they're hurting the very people that they're claiming to be representing and helping.
Right. So it's not making any sense. So sad all around, and we'll just continue to pray for those people. I mean, there's beautiful churches there too, that are old churches that are being burned down. So we'll be praying there that whoever's doing this is brought to justice and that it ends swiftly. So all right, let's head into story number 3. And a former sex education teacher in Manhattan has resigned her position after teaching 6-year-old students that it, quote, feels good to touch their genitals. And if you're watching on the live stream here, you're seeing one of the videos that she allegedly played. And in it, this person the kids make a joke about one of their private areas, and then the teacher swoops in there and starts explaining all these things about how, way too many details that a teacher should be giving 6-year-old children when it's not their parents. So the teacher is Justine Ange Fonte, and she first faced some backlash back in June when she shared videos with her young students teaching them how to touch their bodies in intimate ways. And so she reportedly played animated videos such as the one we're showing now that discussed a whole host of inappropriate details about male and female body parts. She had a salary of about $55,000, and now she's unemployed. And she had a wide number of duties, but facilitated instruction on gender identity and sexual consent. She also taught at Columbia Grammar and Preparatory School, and faced some criticism back in May over a porn literacy lesson she taught to high schoolers. That class exposed students to a, quote, intersectional focus on mainstream porn, and presentations often included very explicit language. School administrators did issue an apology to parents. Those parents did not know about this material that was being taught. by Fonte. So she said she quit her job because her bosses, quote, failed to back me up once there was criticism, and even claiming that the backlash against her, quote, cost me my safety. She went on to say she stands by her lessons and hopes to, quote, equip students with, quote, a way that they can exercise body agency and consent by knowing exactly what those parts are, what they're called, and how to take care of them. And now she's saying she'll move on to writing children's books. So what's the left saying? Well, the left has been pushing sort of radical agendas like this when it comes to teaching sex and gender issues for some time. I mean, we've seen things like Drag Queen Story Hour, which who would have thought to put those two things together is, for kids is bizarre. What's the right saying? Well, the rights generally argue that it's not the school's place to teach such things, especially without telling parents first. And so why does it matter? It matters, Trey, because, we're in an era here of left-leaning bias in major institutions, and it's sort of yielded way to full-blown radical left activism. And so parents need to be made aware and be constantly informed as to what their kids are getting at these schools and what people are trying to push as the norm. And so we can't have our heads in the sand on that. And like I like to refer to from the Bible, we've got to be like the sons of Issachar, who are not, you don't learn a lot about them, but in the Old Testament there, but you do learn that they were people who understood the times in which we live. And so an important thing for us to do as Christians today when it comes to these disturbing topics.
Yeah, and I always see people, particularly, a lot of times people who are either just kind of try to be apolitical or who are left-leaning, who will kind of roll their eyes when they see stories like this, saying, "Oh, you've picked one story out of a million.
Right.
This stuff isn't happening everywhere. Like you're just taking an exception and making an example of it." But the sad thing is, I mean, you and I are in this, every day, and a lot of other people are paying a lot of attention to it. The people who are looking at this constantly can see that it's not just an exceptional every once in a while story. These are just cropping up more and more and more, and they are coming to be representative of public school systems, particularly when the left kind of takes a hold of these school boards and they're able to put this stuff in. So my question with Fonte is just, she first faced some national backlash in May. And it took all the way to July for her to resign her position. I just wonder how much longer, even before May, was she teaching this kind of stuff? And it took until July to get her to leave the school. Yeah. I just wonder how long has she been doing this kind of stuff? Because it's not just that I disagree with it or that a lot of Christians or conservatives might disagree with it. It's that it's just completely inappropriate for an adult who's in a place of authority to be talking to 6-year-old kids about sexually intimate subjects. Yeah. Like, it is just there's no way, I don't think, that you can make an argument to justify that as acceptable, because at 6 years old, kids don't even understand, have any sort of grasp of what you're talking about, and they shouldn't.
Well, and the really other disturbing part of this is that they feel that it's a educator from a government school's job to jump in and teach that, especially at such a young age. The fact that they feel that is necessary and their duty, that it's the state's duty to go ahead and teach that to kids, when really it's obviously the parents' job, and it should be up to the parents' sole discretion about when they teach their kids things like that. So that is the larger disturbing part, is that and why I mentioned the activism, because it really does feel like they have this duty that they think it's their job to raise these kids, when in reality, the public schools is not there to raise children. It's there to teach them the basics of education that they need to be competitive in the world. And the rest of the stuff should be left for the parents.
Yeah, I think the unfortunate reality is that kids, whether it's instances like this, which are just completely wrong, or if it's just through their friends and talking, kids are going to be exposed to some level of this kind of stuff. So I think, the way I was raised is my parents just had kind of an open door policy. If you've got a question about something or you want to talk about something, feel comfortable to come ask us. And I think as Christians, that needs to be the tack that we take, because I think that's one of the best ways to respond to this kind of stuff is just make it a safe place for your kids to come and ask you questions about sexuality, about, what does scripture say about this? How should I understand this? Or, even if your kids don't ask from a biblical perspective, be ready to give them an answer based on scriptural principles, and just be comfortable to have those conversations with your kids, because they're going to be thinking about it, or they're going to be presented with it in one way or another. So as Christians, I think the best thing we can do is just to equip as parents, to be equipped to answer those things for our kids, so that they don't go searching for them somewhere else.
All right.
So, all right, story number 4. So, a judge in Texas has ordered a Muslim woman seeking a divorce from her husband to appear in a tribunal governed by Sharia law. I have to say, Dan, that this story is just, I don't fully understand and grasp how all of this came to be, but nevertheless, let me get into some of the details. So,
it feels like it should be a Babylon B. It feels like it should be a Babylon B headline or something like that.
Right, like this it doesn't seem like a real story, but I know I digress. So Collin County District Judge Andrea Thompson, she ruled in March that Miriam Ayed must forego the justice system's legal paths for divorce and instead submit to mediation under a fiqh panel governed by a Muslim group based in Saudi Arabia. That's according to the Washington Examiner. So the judge based her decision on the fact that Ayed signed a prenuptial agreement with her husband, Ayed Hashim Latif, stating she would permit her marriage if necessary to be arbitrated by Sharia. Ayed's legal complaint argues that the Islamic Tribunal violates her rights as defined by the U.S. Constitution as well as the Texas state constitution, pointing out that a woman's testimony is worth only half that of a man's under Sharia law. The application of Islamic law means that the weight and credibility of the evidence provided by the wife will be half of that of any male who testifies or provides evidence, including the husband, the court document states. Thus, the wife will neither be meaningfully heard nor afforded a meaningful opportunity to present evidence material to the controversy, referring, of course, to the divorce. So despite Ayed's concerns, Thompson, the judge, said that the agreement was legally binding and she has to go to a tribunal. So obviously this is not, a left or right story. Certainly there are some angles there, but it's more, it matters to believers and should matter to all Americans, because this is just, seems like it's an affront to what should be her constitutionally protected rights, Dan. So a ruling last month actually ended up reaffirming Thompson's March decision. So now Ayed's attorney is taking the issue to Texas appeals court, arguing the terms of the prenuptial agreement are unconscionable, and claiming Ayed was coerced into signing the prenuptial agreement, without fully understanding what she was signing her name to. So I think the takeaway here as believers, Dan, is just to be prayerful for Ayed, be prayerful for the court system, the legal system. I'm not a legal scholar, obviously, so I don't understand the ins and outs of the law here. But from the outside, it seems to me like the judge, essentially said, yeah, I know this is a cult and they're doing wrong and illegal things, but I have to uphold their First Amendment right to abuse you. I mean, that's what it sounds like on paper. Certainly there's some complexities there that we don't understand, but as believers, like I said, I think our responsibility here is to be prayerful for a just outcome for this woman and for the legal system.
Yeah, I mean, to fall back on the prenup, it's like, well, at what point is a prenup, when are you able to just say, well, wait a minute, because if I have a prenup that says I can chop off your head if you try to leave me. Well, the judge can't then go, well, it says it right there in the prenup. You can go ahead and chop off your head. So got to do it. It's in the prenup, at some point you should be able to draw the lines on some things that are written in a prenup. Just because you have a contract doesn't mean you have to uphold it, especially if it's signed under duress and it has something as absurd as what is in this one.
It just seems like, I don't know. It seems to me like the Constitution, the National Constitution, and then the Texas State Constitution. I would assume that they usurp whatever is written in a prenuptial agreement. Like they're supreme over something that was in a prenuptial agreement signed between a husband and a wife, particularly one that says that a woman's opinion, her testimony, is only worth half of a man's because she might not be able to remember the details. Like that to me is just like, oh, well, they're slam dunk. That violates the constitutional rights there of this wife. But we'll keep an eye on this story and keep reporting on it at Faithwire and at CBN. But it's a head scratcher to me because I don't understand how we're to this point, particularly in Texas, like you said at the top of the podcast.
Yes, indeed. So once again, Trey, we have, I think, failed to deliver on an uplifting end story. But I will say, I'll throw in this here as we got the ending music rolling in. We close out the week. The Phoenix Suns and Monty Williams, the Christian coach who we talked about earlier, they're up 2-0 in the series, halfway home to a title. So there's something positive you can be looking for. So, all right, God bless you all. Have a great weekend. We shall see you back here on Monday with more news from a Christian perspective. God bless. Don't forget to subscribe. Leave a rating on iTunes. I keep forgetting to say it, so shame on me.
Well, anybody who's still watching the live stream, your duty for today, before you log off your computer, iPhone, or whatever, go subscribe and give us a lot of stars, all the stars, and write us a nice review.
Yeah, when I say leave a rating, not a bad rating. I mean, if you don't like us, fine, whatever. But
just move on.
Don't go leave. Yeah, move on. Don't then rub it in our faces and then leave a bad rating. Leave a good rating. That'd be the Christian thing to do. So, but in all seriousness, though, you got enough secular news out there, right? I mean, why do you need more of that? You don't.
Yeah.
I mean, so many times too, we look at stories where when there is that Christian faith element to it. I mean, first of all, you can't separate anything that's happening from God. Like none of this is like, well, we can bring God into some of these stories. This is God's world. Everything thus is sort of enveloped into him. So you can't separate those two things. But regardless, like the media tends to try to push that out. And so even when there's an obvious faith element, the media will put it out. So would urge you to watch and follow CBN News and faithwire.com because we don't do that. We do the exact opposite. So
yeah, for sure. And there is, like you said, there's always a faith angle and there's always something to learn in a way. So I think that's something that I hope we provide is just to give you, even if there's not an obvious faith angle, we want to give you the handles to have those conversations with people in your life because they're stories that matter and they're hot button issues. So as Christians, we need to be informed about this kind of stuff.
Yeah, and we love mobilizing people to pray. We've talked a lot about how this audience is fantastic.
Yeah.
The CBN audience, Faithwire audience, often prays for issues. So the rest of the media will kind of latch onto that. Well, thoughts and prayers aren't enough. Now, I would agree, thinking something it doesn't really do anything. But prayer, to the God of the universe absolutely does something, especially when lots of Christians are doing it. So we always encourage that. And so that's another great thing about being kind of part and following a Christian news network, is that other Christians are being moved to pray about the things that are happening in this world that matter. So, all right. Well, on to the weekend for y'all. And we're going to be back at it, creating some more stories and writing and posting and doing all that good stuff. So thanks for being here.